5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. And you know, I think, the other, and the last point on, last 2 points in this area was to understand the difference between the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and the treaties Israel signed with Egypt and Jordan. The treaties they signed with Egypt and Jordan were simply about security and territory. They didn't involve any of the issues of the Jewish narrative, if you will. And these and this discussion does involve the issues of the Jewish narrative. Judea, Samaria, Jerusalem, those are issues that matter to an awful lot of Israelis, to an awful lot of Jews, and none of those issues were there in the Egyptian or Jordanian discussions. And finally, the question we discussed is, what does a Palestinian state look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 25 years from now? Israel cares. It's not just throwing the keys over the wall and saying, you know, do whatever you want. Israel cares a lot who the allies of that state are, who the enemies of that state are, what the nature of the government of that state is. And, you know, probably not. I know that Salam Fayyad, whom I've had the pleasure to meet with and is an extraordinary leader, you know, is thinking about that. I'm not sure the Israelis are thinking enough about it. Jerusalem, we had 2 strong and passionate views, and you've heard them. One is Jerusalem's the heart and soul of the Jewish people. It belongs to the Jewish people. It can't be bargained away. That every prime minister of Israel comes to the United States and says Jerusalem is the undivided eternal capital of the Jewish people, and everybody stands up and applauds wildly. One view. The other view is Jerusalem has, in modern history, never been a unified city. Israel, when it annexed parts of Jerusalem, did not give Israeli citizenship to the Arab residents of East Jerusalem. It's neglected the Arab neighborhoods. It's treated the Arab schools in ways that are unattractive. And so what difference does it really make to Israel if all of those areas, which are not Jewish, really don't have any Jews in them, are occupied almost entirely by Arabs, are spun out into an Arab city? And those two views are passionately held. Obviously, the Holy Basin is a more complicated, more difficult problem than just the splitting. And, you know, I mean, if you may remember, the Geneva Accords actually talk about having no sovereignty in the Holy Basin and leaving it under God's sovereignty, whatever that might mean. But this does go back to my point earlier about whatever one does with the Holy Basin, that's what the Saudis will care about, and that's what much of the Muslim world will care about. They may not care about the Palestinians, they do care about what happens to Jerusalem. And then somebody raised the question quite rightly and said, even though you have these 2 passionate views about Jerusalem and you know, isn't that debate really over? The fact that the Israelis signed the roadmap, the fact that they're engaged in conversations, the fact that every Israeli politician, almost every Israeli politician talks about 2 states for 2 people, doesn't that really mean that they recognize and are willing to accept that Jerusalem needs to be divided in some way, either physically divided or sovereignty shared in some way? It's inconceivable to think that there could be a peace treaty, 2 states for 2 people without some splitting or sharing of Jerusalem. It's just not going to be acceptable. And so I guess, you know, anybody who says, yeah, I'm in favor of 2 states, but I'm not in favor of either a splitting or sharing of Jerusalem is not really in favor of 2 states. But the fact that the government of Israel has signed the roadmap, has continued to negotiate in good faith, I believe, leads you to believe that in a large sense, these 2 very, very aggressive positions, you know, that it's really, that the most extreme of those positions are just no longer viably on the table. You know that almost every discussion says we'll leave Jerusalem to decide at a later point, push off that to the last stage of negotiations. There were a number of people around the table who quite properly said the only reason in a negotiation you push off an issue until later is if you think it's going to be easier to solve later. And It's hard to argue why it is that Jerusalem is going to be easier to solve later. The demographics get more complicated. The theory is that somehow there's going to be additional trust between the parties, and so it's going to be easier to solve the hard issue later. And I think the general view was that's not true. It's not true. It's probably not going to be easier later. If it's not going to be easier later, then let's try to deal with it now. Two last points on Jerusalem is that there are, although Jerusalem is thought about from the context of the political issue, the heart and soul issue, it's not a religious issue, it's not thought about as a security issue, it actually has important security dimensions. And so whatever one feels about the religious cultural side of that, it does have security dimensions. Who comes into Jerusalem? Who goes out of Jerusalem? How do you, if Jerusalem is an open city and you let everybody come in, how do you make sure that people who mean mischief for Israel can't come out of it on the other side? And those are not obvious questions or easy questions. And then the last issue we talked about was that Israel and Jews generally may have made a mistake in somehow the Muslim community, the Palestinians, have embraced the Christian narrative about Jerusalem. And we saw another example of that this week when the Catholic bishops kind of came out and talked about a two-state solution. In ways, if you look at history, the Jews have actually been much more open to Christians being able to control their own sites, see their own sites, etc., than when Jordan controlled the old city. And yet, notwithstanding that, the Palestinians have just done a much better job than the Israelis in embracing the Christian narrative and getting the Christians to be supportive. I'll try to be quick here. Settlements. This was the one area in which I had to do my best as the moderator here to avoid the shouting between people. As I said, we had the extremes on both sides here. And the settlement argument, and I guess it's worth just a couple of minutes because the phrase settlement gets used so often, and one can cut settlements a lot of different ways, but let's at least cut it two ways here. There are the neighborhoods of East Jerusalem that represent about 2/3, about 500,000 people, settlers, if we want to use that phrase. Somewhere around 2/3 or 3/4 of them are in the neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. Those are neighborhoods that even at Camp David in 2000, Arafat conceded would be part of Israel, and they'd be part of the land swaps that would occur. And you're dealing with about the other third of the settlers. When we talk about settlements, there's no one who debates that that 2/3 of those neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, which are technically settlements, or at least under the Obama definition of settlements, are settlements, but those will be part of Israel in any possible treaty that emerges. The other third is where the debate comes in. And those are in Judea and Samaria, and the settlers will make the argument that is really the Jewish roots on the land, to the point where they said, Theodor Herzl turned down Uganda when that was suggested to him, and and Herzl's response, which I thought was quite clever, he said, I go visit my grandmother and I have to go a long way to see her. There are a lot of old women that live much closer to my house, and that doesn't quite do the same for me. And that was his answer to why he was insisting upon the Holy Land as a state for Jews and not Uganda, which was offered to him.